The Terrifier. The Chapter 1. The Interview. The fluorescent lights of the mental institution buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Victoria Hyes's gaunt face. Her hands, marked with faded scars, trembled as she wrapped them around a paper cup filled with water that had long since gone warm. Across the metal table, two detectives waited patiently, their tape recorder creating a soft whirring sound in the sterile room. "Miss Hyes," Detective Sarah Morrison began, her voice gentle but firm. "We need you to tell us everything you remember about that night. Every detail matters." Victoria's eyes darted to the barred windows where darkness was settling over the city. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Halloween," she whispered. "It's almost Halloween again, isn't it?" Detective Morrison exchanged glances with her partner, Detective Reynolds, before nodding. "Yes, but you're safe here. Nothing can harm you." "Safe?" Victoria's fingers tightened around the cup until it crumpled slightly. "None of us are safe as long as he's out there. That thing. You don't understand what he is." "Tell us about him." Reynolds leaned forward, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "Tell us about Art the Clown." Victoria flinched at the name, water sloshing over the cup's rim onto her hospital-issued pants. The dark stain spread like blood across the thin fabric, and for a moment, she was back there watching the real thing pool across concrete floors. "He doesn't just kill people," she began, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He performs. Everything is a show to him. The way he moves, the way he—" She swallowed hard. "The way he makes you watch." The tape recorder continued its quiet revolution as Victoria closed her eyes, memories flooding back in vivid, horrific detail. "It started at Will's Pizzeria. My sister Tara and Dawn were there, just getting a late-night slice, you know? Normal girls doing normal things on Halloween." A tear rolled down her cheek. They didn't know they were auditioning for his next performance. "What do you mean by performance?" Morrison prompted gently. Victoria's eyes snapped open, and there was something wild in them now, something that made even the seasoned detectives shift uncomfortably in their seats. "He never speaks, never makes a sound, but his face, that smile, it never changes, even when he's—" She stopped, choking back a sob. "He wants you to see his art. That's what it's all about. He turns murder into theater, and we were all just players in his grand production." Reynolds clicked his pen, preparing to take notes. "Start from the beginning, Miss Hyes. Tell us everything you saw." Victoria stared at her reflection in the observation window, barely recognizing the hollow-eyed woman looking back at her. In the glass, for just a moment, she thought she saw a flash of black and white makeup, a silver-toothed grin. "You want to know what happened?" she asked, her voice steadying as she resigned herself to reliving the nightmare. "Then you need to understand that what I'm about to tell you isn't just about death. It's about the space between terror and madness, where Art the Clown makes his home." She took a deep breath, and as the autumn sun disappeared completely behind the horizon, Victoria Hyes began to tell her story, unaware that somewhere in the city, a silent figure in grease paint was preparing for his next performance. Chapter 2. Pizza at Midnight. The neon sign of Will's Pizzeria buzzed and flickered against the October darkness, casting alternating shadows of red and blue across the rain-slicked streets. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed steadily over the nearly empty restaurant, where the scent of garlic and tomato sauce hung heavy in the midnight air. Tara Hyes pushed through the glass door, the small bell chiming above her head as her sister Dawn followed close behind. Their Halloween costumes were slightly damp from the light drizzle outside. Tara in her witch outfit, Dawn dressed as a cat, both of them laughing about the party they just left. "God, I'm starving," Dawn announced, making her way to the counter, where Will, the owner, was wiping down the stainless steel surface. His tired eyes brightened at the sight of customers. "Ladies," Will nodded, "almost closing time, but we've got a few fresh slices left." Tara scanned the nearly empty pizzeria, her eyes settling on the sole occupant in the corner booth. The sight made her breath catch in her throat. A clown, dressed in black and white, sat perfectly still, his white painted face turned directly toward them. His costume wasn't the typical bright colors of a party clown. It was monochromatic, like something from an old photograph or a nightmare. "2 slices of pepperoni," Dawn said, seemingly oblivious to the clown's presence. And maybe some garlic knots if you've got any left? Tara nudged her sister, nodding subtly toward the corner. Dawn's eyes widened slightly as she finally noticed him. The clown's makeup was immaculate, too perfect, like a mask that had been painted on. His silver-toothed smile remained fixed and unnatural as he continued to stare. "Oh great," Dawn whispered. "Some creep taking the whole Halloween thing way too seriously." Will glanced over at the corner booth, a slight frown crossing his features. "That guy came in about an hour ago. Hasn't ordered anything, just sits there." He shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but Tara noticed the unease in his voice. The sisters took their slices to a booth as far from the clown as possible, but the small size of the pizzeria made the distance feel insignificant. Every few seconds, Tara would glance up, only to find those dark, unblinking eyes still fixed on them. "Stop looking," Dawn hissed, taking a bite of her pizza. "You're just encouraging him." "There's something wrong with him," Tara whispered back. "Like, really wrong. Who just sits and stares like that?" As if on cue, the clown slowly raised one white-gloved hand and waggled his fingers in a mock wave. His smile never changed, never faltered, but somehow seemed to grow wider. "Okay, that's it." Dawn stood up, her slice half-eaten. "Let's get out of here. This is getting too weird." Tara couldn't agree more. They gathered their things quickly, leaving cash on the table. As they headed for the door, Tara risked one final glance back. The clown was gone from his booth. The bell chimed again as they stepped out into the night, the rain now falling more steadily. They hurried down the sidewalk, their boots splashing through puddles that reflected the neon signs above. "Where did he go?" Dawn asked suddenly, looking back at the pizzeria. Through the window, they could see the booth was empty, and Will was cleaning it as if the clown had never been there. "Let's just get to the car," Tara said, fishing for her keys. "The sooner we—" She stopped mid-sentence. There, under the flickering streetlight ahead, stood a black and white figure. The rain ran down his painted face in rivulets, but the makeup remained perfect, undisturbed. That silver-toothed smile gleamed in the darkness. "Tara?" Dawn's voice shook. "Run!" Behind them, the neon sign of Will's Pizzeria sputtered and went dark, leaving only the sound of rain and the silent, watching figure of Art the Clown, ready to begin his performance. Chapter 3. The Chase Begins. The sisters' boots pounded against the wet pavement as they ran, the sound echoing off brick walls and the empty streets. Dawn fumbled with her phone, trying to dial Mike's number while keeping pace with Tara. "Left!" Tara screamed, grabbing Dawn's arm and yanking her down a narrow alley. The sodium lights cast strange shadows through the fire escapes above, making it impossible to tell which dark shapes might be their pursuer. Dawn's phone finally connected. "Mike? Mike, please," she gasped between breaths. "We're being followed, near Will's Pizza? Some fucking clown?" They emerged onto Monroe Street, momentarily disoriented by the streaming headlights of a passing car. Tara spun around, scanning the alley they just escaped. Nothing. No sign of the black and white figure. "He's gone," Tara panted, doubling over with her hands on her knees. "I think we lost him." "Mike's on his way," Dawn said, her cat ears now askew on her head. "He said to get to the gas station on 12th. He'll meet us there." They started walking quickly, staying under the streetlights, jumping at every sound. The Halloween decorations that had seemed festive earlier now took on a menacing quality. Grinning jack-o'-lanterns, plastic skeletons swaying in the wind, and store window displays featuring circus themes that made Tara's stomach turn. "Did you see the way he moved?" Dawn whispered, hugging herself against the cold rain. "It wasn't natural, like some kind of twisted mime." "Don't," Tara warned. "Just don't talk about." A trash can crashed behind them. They whirled around to see a stray cat dart across the street. Both sisters let out nervous laughs, the tension momentarily broken. That's when they saw him. Art stood motionless on the opposite corner, his head tilted at an impossible angle. But what made Tara's blood run cold wasn't his presence. It was what he was holding. In his white-gloved hands was Dawn's purse, the one she'd left behind at the pizzeria in their panic to escape. With exaggerated, theatrical movements, Art began removing items from the purse. He held up Dawn's driver's license, studying it with exaggerated interest, before looking directly at them and pointing to the address printed there. His silver teeth gleamed as his smile grew impossibly wider. "Oh God," Dawn choked. He knows where we live. Art dropped the purse and began walking toward them with slow, deliberate steps. His movements were unnaturally smooth, like a wind-up toy soldier. Each step was punctuated by the splash of his oversized shoes in the puddles. The gas station. Tara grabbed Dawn's hand. Run. They bolted down the street, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Behind them, Art's footsteps maintained their steady rhythm, unhurried, confident, like a predator that knew its prey would eventually tire. Dawn's phone rang, making them both jump. "Mike," she answered breathlessly. "Where are you?" "I'm at the gas station." Mike's voice crackled through the speaker. "Where are you guys? What's going on?" "We're almost there," Dawn panted. "Just stay on the phone, please." They rounded the corner onto 12th Street. The fluorescent glare of the gas station beckoned like a lighthouse in the darkness. Mike's car was visible in the parking lot, and they could see him pacing under the canopy. "Mike?" Dawn screamed, waving frantically. He turned toward their voices, relief visible on his face even from a distance. Then his expression changed to confusion, then horror as he looked past them. Tara made the mistake of glancing back. Art was gone again. But as they ran toward the gas station, Tara caught movement in her peripheral vision. Through the windows of the shops they passed, she could see flashes of black and white. Art's reflection, keeping pace with them, somehow moving through the buildings themselves. Mike was running toward them now. But Tara knew with sick certainty that they wouldn't all be making it to safety tonight. Art's performance was just beginning, and he'd already chosen his audience. The gas station's lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire block into darkness. Chapter 4. The Abandoned Building. The old factory loomed against the stormy sky, its broken windows gaping like jagged teeth in the darkness. Mike's car skidded to a stop in front of the chain-link fence, its headlights cutting through the rain to illuminate the "No Trespassing" sign swaying in the wind. "Are you insane?" Dawn grabbed Mike's arm as he killed the engine. "We can't go in there." "We don't have a choice," Mike responded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "He's blocked every street back to the main road. It's like he's hurting us here." Tara stared at the crumbling brick edifice, her witch costume now soaked and clinging to her skin. In the rearview mirror, she could see the distant headlights of Art's black sedan, creeping closer with inexorable patience. "Better in there than out here in the open," she decided, pushing her door open. The others followed, rushing through the gap in the fence where countless other trespassers had bent the metal away. The building's interior hit them with the stench of mold and decay. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, disturbing years of dust. Mike's phone flashlight carved a weak path through the darkness, revealing rusted machinery and graffiti-covered walls. "My phone's dead," Dawn whispered, clutching Tara's arm. "How is it dead?" "It was at 50%. A distant door slammed somewhere above them, the sound reverberating through the empty space. They froze, listening to the echo fade into silence. "There has to be a way through to the other side," Mike said, trying to sound confident. "These old buildings usually connect to." The beam of his flashlight caught something that made them all stop breathing. On the wall ahead, fresh graffiti glistened wetly in the light, a crude smile drawn in what looked disturbingly like blood, with the words, "The show must go on," scrawled beneath it. "He's already inside," Tara realized, her voice barely audible. "He wanted us to come here." A giggle echoed through the darkness, not a human sound, but rather like the squeak of balloon animals being twisted into shape. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This way," Mike urged, pulling them toward a stairwell. "Up is better than down." They climbed the metal stairs as quietly as possible, each step producing a soft groan that seemed deafening in the silence. The second floor was a maze of old offices, their doors hanging off hinges, papers scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Dawn suddenly stopped, causing Tara to bump into her. "Do you smell that?" The others paused, and then it hit them. The sickly sweet smell of cotton candy mixed with something metallic and wrong. The scent grew stronger as they moved forward, leading them to a closed door that looked newer than the others. Mike reached for the handle, but Tara grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she pleaded. "Whatever's in there, he wants us to find it." The door burst open on its own, revealing a room that would haunt their nightmares forever. Christmas lights strung across the ceiling cast a multicolored glow over walls covered in circus posters and funhouse mirrors. A child's carousel horse stood in one corner, its paint peeling to reveal rotting wood beneath. But worst of all was the old TV set in the center of the room, playing static on its screen. As they watched in horror, the static cleared to show security camera footage of them, standing in that very room. The image panned out to show Art the Clown standing directly behind them, his head cocked to one side, that eternal smile gleaming in the Christmas lights. They spun around, but the doorway was empty. The TV erupted with the sound of circus music, the kind played by wind-up music boxes, but distorted and wrong. The cameras showed Art now on the floor below them, dragging something heavy and dark across the concrete. "Oh God," Dawn choked, pointing to the corner of the room. There, neatly folded, was Monica Brown's jacket, the girl who'd gone missing last Halloween. The lights went out, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the strobing TV screen. When they came back on seconds later, the room had changed. The walls were now covered in Polaroid photographs, hundreds of them, showing Art's previous performances, his previous victims, and written in fresh paint across them all, "Tonight's show will be different." Mike's flashlight flickered and died, leaving them with only the pulsing glow of the TV. Somewhere in the darkness they heard the distinct squeak of oversized shoes on concrete, growing closer. The performance was about to begin. Chapter 5. Monica's Last Stand. Monica Brown pressed herself against the cold basement wall, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle her breathing. The maintenance tunnels beneath the abandoned factory stretched before her like a concrete maze, pipes dripping rusty water onto the floor. Her other hand clutched her phone, its screen dark and useless, just like all the others' phones had gone dead. She'd gotten separated from the group after Art had appeared in the clown room. In the chaos that followed, she'd fled downstairs, thinking she could find a way out through the building's underbelly. Now that decision felt like her worst mistake. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound of his shoes echoed through the tunnels. Monica couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. The ancient corridors seemed to twist the sound into impossible directions. She'd already learned that Art didn't follow the normal rules of space and movement. Twice she'd run from him only to find him ahead of her, waiting with that terrible silver smile. "Please," she whispered to herself, "please, someone find me." A shadow moved at the end of the corridor. Monica held her breath, pressing herself further into the alcove where she hid. The emergency lights cast alternating patches of dim red light and absolute darkness through the tunnels. In one of those dark patches, she saw it, the silhouette of an oversized bow tie. Art stepped into the red light, but he wasn't looking in her direction. Instead, he was focused on something in his hands, a small music box. With exaggerated, theatrical movements, he began to wind it. The tune that emerged was a corrupted version of Pop Goes the Weasel, playing at a speed just slow enough to be disturbing. Art's head bobbed in time with the music as he started to dance, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. Monica saw her chance. While he was distracted with his macabre performance, she could make a run for the stairs she'd passed earlier. Slowly, she began to edge along the wall. The music stopped. Art's head snapped toward her, his neck cracking at an impossible angle. The music box fell from his hands, clattering on the concrete floor. His smile seemed to grow wider, stretching beyond what any human face should allow. Monica ran. Her footsteps echoed through the tunnels as she sprinted past pipes and through puddles. She could hear nothing behind her. Art never made a sound when he moved. But she knew he was following. He was always following. The stairs appeared ahead, and Monica felt a surge of hope. But as she reached them, she realized her mistake. These weren't the stairs she'd come down earlier. These led to a dead end, a sealed maintenance room with walls covered in old circuit breakers and fuse boxes. "No, no, no," she sobbed, pulling at the rusted door handle. It didn't budge. The emergency light above her flickered and died. In the darkness, she heard the soft squeak of shoes behind her. When the light sputtered back to life, Art stood at the bottom of the stairs. In his hands, he held an oversized bag, the kind party clowns use for their props. With flourishing gestures, like a magician preparing for a trick, he reached inside. Monica screamed when she saw what he pulled out. It wasn't a balloon animal or juggling pins. "Please," she begged, pressing herself against the door. "Why are you doing this?" Art tilted his head, considering her question. Then he pointed to his painted smile, then to her face, then drew a finger across his throat. The message was clear. He wanted to make her smile. Forever. The light flickered one final time. In the last flash of red, Monica saw Art advance, his tools raised like conductors' batons. Above them, somewhere in the building, she could hear Tara and the others calling her name. But they would never reach her in time. Art's most intimate performance was about to begin, and Monica Brown was his unwitting star. The basement plunged into darkness, and the real screaming started. Up in the clown room, the TV screen flickered to life, showing new footage. Art's latest masterpiece was ready for its debut, and the night was still young. Fresh photos would soon join his grotesque gallery, and his audience was waiting. The show, after all, must go on. Chapter 6: The Clown's Playground. Monica's screams had faded to silence, but their echoes still seemed to bounce off the walls of the abandoned factory. Tara, Dawn, and Mike stood frozen in the doorway of what could only be described as Art's personal museum of horrors, the clown room. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the walls. The Christmas lights cast rainbow shadows over a collection that defied sanity. Vintage circus posters had been modified, their cheerful clown faces replaced with Art's signature makeup and smile. Polaroids covered nearly every surface, each showing a different performance. Victims posed in grotesque tableaus, their faces forever frozen in Art's twisted vision of entertainment. "Look at the dates," Dawn pointed, her voice shaking. "These go back years. Some of these people, they were never found." Tara moved deeper into the room, drawn to a glass display case in the corner. Inside, arranged with museum-like precision, were souvenirs, personal effects from previous victims. A charm bracelet, a driver's license, a blood-stained bow tie. Each item was carefully labeled with a date and a small silver star, like reviews for a theater performance. The old TV in the corner suddenly crackled to life, static giving way to crystal-clear footage. The security camera feed showed the basement where Monica had run, but the image was now tinted an artificial red. Art stood center frame, taking a theatrical bow toward the camera. Behind him, something lay crumpled in the shadows. "We have to help her," Mike started toward the door, but stopped when the feed changed. Now it showed them, standing in the clown room, watching themselves on the TV. The camera angle was impossible. There were no visible cameras in the room. As they watched, Art's face appeared in the corner of the TV screen, pressing against it from the inside like a creature trying to break through glass. "He's playing with us," Tara realized, backing away from the display case. "This whole building. It's his stage." The Christmas lights began to flicker in rhythm, like a carnival attraction coming to life. The carousel horse in the corner started to turn on its own, its rusted poles screaming as it rotated. Wind-up toys on the shelves began to move, their tin bodies jerking in spasmodic dances. Dawn screamed and pointed to the wall of photographs. The images were changing, the faces in them morphing one by one into Art's painted visage, all turning to stare at the group with silver-toothed grins. "The door!" Mike shouted, but it was already swinging shut on its own. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The TV screen went black, then lit up with 4 words in white text. "Choose your roles carefully." Suddenly, the room's temperature plunged. Their breath came out in visible puffs as the carousel spun faster, its haunting carnival music now playing in reverse. The walls seemed to pulse, the photos rippling like living things. In the center of the room, something began to rise through the floor. Art, emerging as if through water, his costume pristine despite the impossible entrance. He held up his bag of tricks, reaching inside with flourishing gestures. What he pulled out made them all freeze in horror. 3 masks, crude, handmade things that mimicked his own painted face. With exaggerated movements, he held them out like a gracious host offering party favors. The TV flickered again, showing a new message. Every show needs understudies. Art's head tilted at an impossible angle, his smile growing wider as he waited for them to make their choice. The masks dangled from his fingers, swaying slightly in the cold air, each one seeming to whisper promises of what was to come. The performance was entering its second act, and Art was ready to teach his newest players the true meaning of theater. Behind him, the wall of photographs continued to change, making room for 3 empty spaces. Spaces waiting to be filled with tonight's featured performers. Chapter 7, Divide and Conquer. The masks clattered to the floor as Mike charged Art, tackling him into the carousel horse. Dawn screamed as the rusty pole finally snapped, sending both figures crashing into the wall of photographs. But when Mike scrambled back to his feet, Art was gone. The space where he should have been was empty, except for a small puff of black smoke. "Run!" Tara yanked the door open. It gave way easily now, as if it had never been stuck. They burst into the hallway, the sound of the carousel's dying music following them like a demented funeral march. "This way!" Mike pointed toward a fire escape he'd spotted earlier, but as they rounded the corner, they found only a brick wall where the window should have been. Impossible. They'd all seen it earlier. "He's changing the building," Dawn realized, her voice breaking, like it's all just a stage he can rearrange. A child's laugh echoed through the corridor. But there was something wrong with it, like a recording played at half speed. It seemed to come from all directions at once. "We have to split up," Tara said suddenly. "Are you insane?" Dawn grabbed her sister's arm. "That's exactly what he wants." "No, listen." Tara's eyes were wild but focused. "He's toying with us, playing with us. If we split up, at least some of us might find a real way out, find help." As if in response to her words, the lights in the corridor began to go out one by one. Darkness creeping toward them like a living thing. "Tara's right," Mike said, pulling out his phone. "Dead, like all their phones." "Dawn, come with me. Tara, take the left corridor. We'll meet at the main entrance in 10 minutes. If anyone finds a way out." "Just scream," Tara finished grimly. The darkness was getting closer. They could hear the soft squeak of Art's shoes somewhere in the blackness, accompanied by the gentle jingling of bells. 10 minutes, Dawn hugged her sister fiercely. "Promise me." "I promise," Tara whispered back. They separated just as the darkness reached them. Tara took the left path, while Mike and Dawn ran right. The building seemed to shift around them, corridors stretching and twisting impossibly. Tara found herself in what must have been an old office space. Cubicle walls created a maze, their fabric coverings rotting and peeling. Papers scattered across the floor rustled in a wind that shouldn't exist this deep in the building. Behind her, she heard Will's voice. "Ladies, almost closing time." She spun around. The pizza shop owner stood there, but something was wrong. His face was too pale, his smile too wide. As she watched in horror, his features began to shift, melting like wax until Art's painted face emerged. Tara ran. Meanwhile, Mike and Dawn descended a stairwell that seemed to go down much further than the building's actual height should allow. The metal steps rang hollow under their feet. "Mike!" Dawn grabbed his sleeve. "Listen." From somewhere below came the sound of Monica's voice, calling for help. "That's not her," Mike said firmly. "We saw the TV. She's... But what if we're wrong?" Dawn's voice was desperate. "What if she's still alive down there?" The voice called again, closer now. It sounded exactly like Monica, but undercut with something else. The tiny squeak of plastic balloons being twisted. "Dawn, don't!" Mike reached for her, but she was already running down the stairs. He followed, but the steps beneath him suddenly flattened into a slide. He tumbled backward as Dawn disappeared into the darkness below. "Dawn!" he screamed. The only response was Art's signature silence and the distant sound of circus music starting up again. In another part of the building, Tara found herself in a long corridor lined with mirrors. Each one showed her reflection, but something was wrong. In one, she wore Art's makeup. In another, she was posed like a mannequin. In a third, she was running, even though she stood still. The reflections began to move independently, turning to watch her with silver-toothed smiles. From somewhere in the building, Dawn screamed. The sound was followed by Mike's voice crying out in pain. Then silence. The 10 minutes were up. In every mirror, Art appeared behind Tara's reflection, raising one finger to his painted lips in a gesture of silence. Then the glass began to crack, spiderweb patterns spreading across each surface. The show was no longer a group performance. Now, each player would get their own private audience with the star. And Art had been practicing this routine for years. Chapter 8. Dawn's Nightmare. The stairs had deposited Dawn into what appeared to be an old boiler room, but something was wrong with the proportions. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, while pipes twisted through the space like metal snakes, hissing steam in rhythmic pulses that sounded disturbingly like laughter. "Mike?" she called out, her voice bouncing back at her in distorted echoes. "Tara?" The cat ears from her costume were long gone, her makeup smeared with tears and sweat. She moved forward cautiously, following the only path between the massive boilers. Each one she passed showed her distorted reflection in its rusted surface, her face stretching and warping until it nearly resembled Art's painted visage. A sound made her freeze. Behind one of the boilers, something was scraping against metal. Dawn held her breath, pressing herself against the warm pipes. Monica's body slid into view, dragging itself across the floor with jerky, puppet-like movements. Her head lifted, revealing Art's makeup roughly painted on her face, her eyes wide and unseeing. Dawn bit back a scream as Monica's body rose to its feet in unnatural segments, like a marionette being pulled upright. Behind her, Art emerged from the shadows, holding crossed wooden control bars above his head. Thin wires glinted in the dim light, running from his hands to Monica's limbs. With theatrical gestures, Art began to make Monica dance, her body moving in grotesque parody of a ballet. Her head lolled lifelessly as he worked his macabre puppet. "Stop it," Dawn whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just stop." Art's head snapped toward her, that eternal smile somehow growing wider. He released the control bars, letting Monica collapse in a heap, and reached into his prop bag. What he pulled out made Dawn's blood run cold. A makeup kit, identical to the one he wore. He held it out to her with an exaggerated bow, like a gentleman offering a gift. Dawn turned to run, but the pipes behind her had shifted, blocking her escape. Everywhere she looked, metal tubes writhed and twisted, reshaping the room into a cage. Steam burst from valves in rhythm, creating a twisted circus melody. Art advanced slowly, makeup kit in one hand, something sharp and silver glinting in the other. His movements were precise, choreographed, each step bringing him closer with the inevitability of a nightmare. "Mike!" Dawn screamed. "Tara! Somebody!" The only response was the hiss of steam and the soft squeak of Art's shoes on the concrete floor. He was taking his time, savoring her terror like a fine wine. This was his favorite part of the performance. The moment his audience realized they were no longer spectators, but unwilling participants. Dawn backed away until she hit a wall. But it wasn't a wall at all. It was a massive mirror that hadn't been there seconds ago. In its reflection, she could see herself, Art approaching behind her, and dozens of previous victims arranged in theatrical poses, all wearing his signature makeup. Art reached out with one white-gloved hand, gently turning Dawn to face the mirror. With his other hand, he began to apply the makeup to her trembling face, transforming her features into a grotesque replica of his own. Each stroke was deliberate, artistic, performed with the care of a master painter creating his masterpiece. Dawn tried to struggle, but her body wouldn't respond. She could only watch in horror as her reflection changed, her identity erasing beneath layers of black and white grease paint. The mirror seemed to ripple, showing possible futures. Dawn posed like a mannequin in Art's collection. Dawn performing for new victims. Dawn becoming just another photograph on his wall of horrors. From somewhere above, she heard Tara calling her name. The sound seemed to break whatever spell Art had cast. Dawn ducked under his arm and ran, smearing the half-applied makeup across her sleeve. She could hear no footsteps behind her, but she knew he was following. He was always following. The boiler room had become a twisted funhouse, mirrors everywhere showing Dawn's transformation from different angles. In some reflections, the makeup was complete. In others, she was still herself. And in one, most terrifying of all, she saw herself wearing Art's costume completely, leading a new victim through the maze. "No," she gasped, touching her face. "I'm still me. I'm still me." The mirrors shattered simultaneously, and Dawn screamed as Art stepped through one of the empty frames, his hands raised like a conductor about to begin a symphony. The show was far from over, and Dawn's role was about to become much more permanent. Chapter 9. Tara's Last Stand. The hallway of broken mirrors led Tara into what had once been the factory's main assembly floor. Moonlight filtered through the broken skylights above, casting fractured shadows across rusted conveyor belts and ancient machinery. Her witch costume hung in tatters around her, a mockery of the Halloween night that now felt like a lifetime ago. Dawn's screams still echoed in her head, but they'd gone silent minutes, or was it hours, ago. Time had lost all meaning in Art's twisted playground. "Where is she?" Tara shouted into the darkness. "What did you do to my sister?" The reply came in the form of the overhead lights suddenly blazing to life, revealing what Art had done to the factory floor. He'd transformed it into a grotesque circus ring, complete with a center ring painted in blood red. Surrounding it were mannequins posed as audience members, each wearing bits and pieces of clothing that Tara recognized from the missing persons reports she'd seen on the news over the years. Art stood in the center ring, but he wasn't alone. Dawn was there too, strung up like a marionette, her face half-painted in his signature style. She was conscious, her eyes wide with terror, but unable to speak or move. "Let her go." Tara's voice shook as she stepped forward. "Please, take me instead." Art tilted his head, considering the offer. With exaggerated movements, he reached into his bag and produced a small chalkboard. His white-gloved fingers moved across it with fluid grace, writing in perfect carnival script, "Every show needs a finale." He flipped the board over and wrote again, "But which sister gets the starring role?" Mike's body suddenly dropped from the darkness above, landing with a sickening thud at Tara's feet. He was still breathing, but his face had been painted to match Art's, his eyes staring sightlessly ahead. Art began to move around the ring with balletic grace, his shoes squeaking a rhythm that seemed to make the mannequins sway. With each step he pulled something new from his seemingly bottomless bag, a straight razor that caught the light, a makeup kit identical to the one he'd used on Dawn, and finally, a camera. "You want a show?" Tara stepped into the ring. "Fine, but let them go." Art's smile grew impossibly wider. He held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, like a director counting down to action. The factory's machinery roared to life around them, conveyor belts moving in impossible directions, creating a mechanical soundtrack to Art's performance. The mannequin audience began to turn their heads in unison, watching. Tara lunged for the razor Art had set down, but he was faster, impossibly faster. He appeared behind her, then in front, then beside her, moving like a glitch in reality. Each time he passed, she felt the cold touch of grease paint on her skin. "No." She wiped frantically at her face, but the makeup wouldn't come off. Each smear only seemed to spread it further, transforming her inch by inch. Dawn struggled against her invisible bonds, trying to scream through lips that wouldn't move. Mike's body twitched on the ground, his fingers spelling out warnings that came too late. Art produced a mirror, showing Tara her reflection. The makeup was spreading like living paint, crawling across her features. But underneath it, something worse was happening. Her face was changing, her smile stretching to match his. "I won't become you," she snarled, and smashed the mirror. Art's silent laugh shook his shoulders as he collected a shard of the broken glass. With a magician's flourish, he pulled a spotlight from thin air, focusing it on Dawn's suspended form. The message was clear: play along, or watch your sister become the star. Tara looked at her partially transformed reflection in the glass shard. Art stood behind her, like a proud teacher watching a student's first performance. The machinery ground louder, the mannequins leaned forward in anticipation, and somewhere in the building, a calliope began to play. The finale was about to begin, and Art had been preparing for this moment all night. One way or another, his show would end with a standing ovation. And a new face added to his eternal audience. Tara gripped the glass shard tighter, feeling it cut into her palm. She had one last chance to save her sister, to end Art's performance forever. But as his painted smile grew wider in the reflection, she realized with horror that part of her was beginning to smile back. The real transformation was just beginning. Chapter 10, Morning Light. The first rays of dawn crept through the factory's broken skylights, painting the circus ring in shades of blood and gold. Detective Morrison stood at the edge of the crime scene tape, watching forensics photograph the grotesque tableau Art had left behind. "Like something from a nightmare," Detective Reynolds muttered beside her, flipping through his notepad. 3 survivors. That's more than he's ever left before. The factory floor told a story that defied explanation, the massive circus ring painted in red. The audience of mannequins dressed in victims' clothes. The complex system of pulleys and wires stretching into the darkness above. And everywhere, mirrors, hundreds of them, most shattered, their fragments reflecting the morning light like stars. "Walk me through it again," Morrison said, though she'd already heard Victoria High's account in the institution. What happened after Tara entered the ring? A forensics photographer called them over to what remained of the central platform. Blood trails told a chaotic story of struggle, but the patterns were wrong. They moved in impossible directions, sometimes flowing upward against gravity. According to the sister's statement, Reynolds consulted his notes. Tara grabbed a piece of mirror and... He paused, frowning. This is where the accounts diverge. Dawn claims Art tried to make Tara join his show. Something about makeup that moved on its own. Mike's still unconscious, but he keeps mumbling about puppet strings and changing faces. Morrison knelt to examine a small chalkboard lying in a pool of congealing blood. 2 messages were still visible beneath the crimson stains. Every show needs a finale. But which sister gets the starring role? And Tara? Morrison asked, though she already knew the answer. Found her in the basement level, Reynolds replied grimly. Alive, but... He trailed off, unable to find the right words. In the hospital, Tara Highs hadn't spoken a word. The doctors said she was in shock. But Morrison had seen her face, seen the way the muscles twitched beneath the skin, fighting against a smile that threatened to stretch too wide. The makeup, Morrison murmured, remembering Victoria's warnings. Did they manage to get it all off? Reynolds didn't answer. They both knew what the hospital staff had reported. No matter how hard they scrubbed, traces of black and white grease paint kept reappearing on Tara's skin, like ink rising from beneath a page. A crash from above made everyone jump. A mirror had fallen from the ceiling, shattering on the factory floor. In the largest fragment, Morrison could have sworn she saw a flash of silver teeth and white gloves, but when she looked again, it showed only her own haunted reflection. His costume, she said suddenly. Did we find it? That's the thing. Reynolds flipped to another page. We found costumes all right. Dozens of them, all identical, going back decades. News articles, too, showing the same makeup, the same smile, as far back as the 1920s. Dawn had been released from the hospital that morning, after the doctors confirmed she was physically unharmed, but she'd left them with a warning. He's not finished. This wasn't the finale he wanted. As if to confirm her words, a technician called them over to the old TV set still sitting in the clown room. The screen was dark, but text suddenly appeared, white against black. Intermission. Then the screen went dark again. Morrison's phone buzzed. A news alert. Another missing person report, just filed. A street performer had vanished from outside a children's party. Witnesses described a black and white clown who'd watched the show from across the street, his silver smile visible even at a distance. He's already starting his next performance, Morrison realized. The morning light continued to fill the factory, but it brought no comfort. Somewhere in the city, Art was preparing for his next show. And as Tara Highs lay in her hospital bed, fighting against the smile that crept across her face in the dark, she knew the truth. Some performances never really end. They just wait for their next encore. Epilogue. In the institution, Victoria Highs watched the sun rise through barred windows. The orderlies had found more grease paint beneath her bandages that morning. The doctor said it was impossible, the wounds had healed years ago, but she knew better. She touched her face, feeling the muscles twitch beneath her fingers, and wondered how long she had before her role in Art's show began again. In the window's reflection, a familiar silver smile began to spread across her features. After all, the show must go on. The end.